I was young, I used to play in bands, like hardcore bands and stuff. So I grew up in New Zealand. I went to high school in New Zealand, and a lot of my friends there were playing in punk bands, and they were all tattooed. And I remember being around 14 or 15 years old, and I was looking at them, and they were the coolest people I've ever seen, you know. To me at that age, skateboarding and listening to punk music was the most like important thing to me at that time. Obviously I couldn't get one because I was really young and my family is a Muslim upbringing. After high school in New Zealand, I came back to Singapore for NS, and by that time I was already 18, and so I still, you know, didn't know what I was doing. I still didn't have any money. I didn't have a job or anything. So I was gonna go to NS, but I ended up going to LaSalle for art school. And when I was in art school, I decided that I wanted to get tattooed lah. I didn't really know how to do it because like my mom is really Islamic. It was a very expensive thing to do was to get tattooed. So I actually got a full-time job after about a year in school, and I deferred my NS. So I got this job specifically to get tattooed, and I started working in this skate shop, and that's when I started to get tattoos. And I was 19 at the time, and I got my first tattoo. You know, it was super fucking painful, and I thought to myself, I'm never gonna do this again. This is shit. And soon after that, I just started getting really covered. And once I started getting covered with a lot of tattoos, and I was still playing in a lot of punk bands and hardcore bands, a lot of my friends started wanting to get tattooed also because we were all around the same age. And because at that time in Singapore, there was no traditional tattoo artist. I mean, there were people that could do traditional, but there was nobody that did specifically traditional. And at that time, there was no like Instagram or Facebook or anything for you to find out about artists and stuff. You just had to kind of go word of mouth or actually visit shops. And at that time, in like early 2000s, visiting a tattoo shop is super intimidating. And I remember just being afraid to even look into the shop, you know, growing up. So when I started to get tattooed by my friend, who was actually an Australian guy living in JB, he was very helpful in like guiding me about basic artwork stuff when it came to traditional tattoos. So I started to draw traditional tattoo designs for my friends who wanted to get tattooed, and they would take it to their artist, and then they would get tattooed by the artist with my drawing as a reference lah. It got to the point where I kept drawing tattoo designs for my friends, and then, you know, they had to take it to their artist and interpret the whole thing, and it started to become quite troublesome for them. They actually convinced me to start tattooing them. So in a way, it was the friends that I grew up with that actually made me start tattooing. I do Western traditional tattoos. A lot of the stuff that I have to do is custom, so it's considered neo-traditional now. Neo-traditional used to be really rounded and really illustrative tattoos that were executed traditionally. But now, because traditional tattoos are actually having a very important role in tattooing now, where they redo classic traditional designs, and that actually is traditional tattooing. So what I do is considered neo-traditional, but more on the traditional side of the artwork. I fell in love with this style because all the people in the bands that I looked up to when I was a kid, they were all covered in traditional tattoos. They were covered in old school tattoos, and at that time, new school was really popular. So a lot of artists were doing really crazy illustrative tattoos that were super colorful. And that was the thing that kind of made me get into tattooing. The lines are really bold, the colors are really bold. And what happens with a tattoo like that is that when you have the lines that contain the color inside, that color cannot escape the carbon from the lines, and that makes the tattoo actually last really long. When you have lines that are bold, the tattoo will look clearer when you're across the street from someone, or when even 10 years time, it's still gonna look pretty much the same from when you did it. The lines will spread a little bit, but if you can imagine the line spreading on a very intricate little tattoo piece, like that's just gonna blow out. And with traditional, the way that you execute the lines and the space you need in between the lines and stuff like that will make the tattoo last. So that's the reason I like it, is the longevity. When people get tattooed by me, usually they already know what kind of stuff that I do. So usually they will have a reference of what I've already done in mind. So with that reference and their idea of what they want, that's where I start to design the tattoo. And most of the time is very classic traditional stuff. So I use a lot of references from old flash, from the 50s or 40s. I use Sailor Jerry flash, Bert Grimm flash, a lot of the old pioneers that did this style, post World War II. And so my design process is mostly like that. Is very collaborative with the client, and usually I prefer it if the client has a very clear idea of what he wants. Because now you see so many tattoos on Instagram, you are distracted by so much different imagery every single minute almost. So when people actually come to me and they tell me that they want a tattoo from me and that I can do whatever I want, usually that's the worst thing for me because I can suggest 100 different things, and everybody's taste is so different, especially now when your taste shifts very, very quickly. So yeah, usually the client will have a very clear idea of what he wants, and that's when I can come up with the best design for that particular client. My routine usually starts like that, where I have a good amount of meditation and relaxation before I actually come to work and start drawing. So Brazilian Jiu-jitsu gives me that in the morning for me to just unload all the stresses or whatever from the day before, and then I come to the shop pretty fresh, and so that's when I start drawing. And usually I'm already energized by the morning. I sit down with the client and I finish up the preliminary design that I've already done, and that's where I come up with the final design. The general rule is the rule of thirds. So you have 1/3 black, 1/3 color, 1/3 skin. So when I tattoo someone, it's the exact same process. So usually I start with the lines, and once the lines are done, I start with the blacks, and from the black shading I can already tell which parts have to be colored and which parts have to be left skin tone. How I go through that process is very mechanical, because most traditional tattoos have flowers or leaves. So I start with the leaves, and from there I'll be able to tell which parts of the tattoo have to be skin and which parts have to be black, and usually it's an alternate. And from there I will then figure out with the client the color palette, and usually I use the same color palette just so that all the tattoos that I do have a little bit of a signature. And from that color palette that I talk to the client with is when I start to differentiate the foreground and background, and that's where I start to put the colors in and make sure that the whole thing has contrast. I think that traditional tattoos look good on all skin types. I've seen really dark black people that have all traditional tattoos and it looks really, really solid, because the contrast that you get from a traditional tattoo usually is 100% contrast. And what I mean is that if your skin tone is 0 and the black is 100, you have skin tone and then you have a black line and then you have black shading, so that's 100% contrast, and that will work with pretty much any skin tone. I have clients that are really, really dark, and I am still able to execute a really contrasty traditional tattoo, because I use, for example, if I have a really dark client, I will use very flat and very bold colors when it comes to the design. And I wouldn't try and gradient the tones, I wouldn't try and round the design in terms of the shading styles. So that is the thing that makes it really, really contrasty, and that would make any skin tone acceptable for a traditional tattoo. when people do a traditional tattoo, you do the lines and then you do the black and then you do the color. There's not really much room for you to layer unless you're doing a really 3D looking neo-traditional piece. And so what I mean is that if you're doing a black and gray piece, usually the artist has to keep going over the same spot over and over again to build the tones and to build the gradient. And that causes way more trauma on the skin. Nowadays, they use a lot of machines that are really soft and that actually cause way less trauma than back in the day when everybody was using coils. So now, actually a lot of black and gray tattoos are very non-traumatic to the skin. But at the same time, with traditional tattoos, there is not much layering over a color, so that actually is a one-hit process. So I hit the lines once, I hit the colors once, the shadings all one time, and that brings down the trauma. In my opinion, a good tattoo has to be really clear. The subject has to be clear from a distance. If I'm standing in front of you 6 feet away, I should be able to tell what the tattoo is. And so that to me is an indication of a good tattoo. My name is Feroze McLeod and I tattoo at Bada Bing Tattoo Firm in Singapore.